This is CBN NewsWatch.
And thank you so much for joining us on this Monday, September 27, 2021. I'm Ephraim Graham. Ahead today, a big week for President Biden's agenda. His $3.5 trillion social spending plan is on the line in Congress. Americans still trapped in Afghanistan will bring you a look at what's being done to get them out. Australia under COVID lockdown so severe, many wonder if it's still a free country. And Oscar winner Denzel Washington says he's been hearing from God. We're going to share what that message is. All those stories and more ahead in this edition of CBN NewsWatch. I want to begin this half hour with a look at what's sure to be a big week for President Joe Biden's agenda. Congress is looking to trim his $3.5 trillion social spending bill, raise the debt ceiling, and keep the government from shutting down Thursday. Dale Hurd is on the story.
The vote on a $1 trillion infrastructure bill that was supposed to happen today has been pushed off until Thursday because Democrats admit they don't have the votes. Speaker Nancy Pelosi Sunday had to walk back today's planned vote on the bipartisan Senate bill for roads and bridges.
Let me just say we're going to pass the bill this week.
But she doesn't have the votes so far.
I'm never bringing a bill to the floor that doesn't have the votes.
Because House progressives in her party won't vote for the roads and bridges infrastructure bill without an agreement on a $3.5 trillion so-called human infrastructure bill, what some call a wish list of big government programs, including things like a civilian climate corps and free community college, paid for by raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy.
The Build Back Better agenda is not some crazy agenda that just a few people support. It's actually the vast majority of the Democratic caucus.
And progressives are threatening to tank the bipartisan roads and bridges infrastructure bill if Congress can't pass the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill.
The votes aren't there. We have to get to that reconciliation bill first.
But moderate Democratic senators like Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona have said they won't support a human infrastructure bill that big. And even Nancy Pelosi is conceding that the massive bill will be cut. Joe Biden still thinks he'll be signing the bills this week.
I'm optimistic about this week. It's going to take the better part of the week, I think.
But there are more pressing matters for Congress. The government runs out of money Thursday and is also set to default on its debt without an increase in the debt ceiling. GOP Senator Pat Toomey told CNN Republicans would vote for a bill to fund the government, but not if it's linked to a debt ceiling increase.
I will certainly be voting no if the Democrats insist on combining the debt ceiling increase or suspension with the continuing operations of the government.
If the debt ceiling is not raised, the government could default on its debt. But Congress has always raised the debt ceiling in the past. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
One of the founders of the Taliban and chief enforcer of its interpretation of Islamic law has told the Associated Press they will once again carry out executions and amputations of hands, though possibly not in public. The interview came as hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans remain in Afghanistan after the U.S. airlifted its citizens out following President Biden's pullout. But as Chris Mitchell now reports, the effort to rescue them is not over.
These covert videos provide a true look at life inside Afghanistan under Taliban rule: arrests, abductions, and executions.
I believe the level of desperation is even worse now without the U.S. troops there, without any exit, and people are hiding in safe houses and hiding on the run. The Taliban is actually door to door doing executions where they're going to grab people, stuffing them in trunks of cars and driving them off the execution sites. I can imagine the on-the-ground panic there is even worse than it was during those evacuation days.
When the U.S. announced its pullout, Chad Robichaux joined other retired Special Forces members to form SaveOurAllies.org. He says they rescued more than 12,000 U.S. citizens and Afghan allies during the chaotic weeks before the U.S. military's final flight out.
The good news is that we're still being successful with evacuations, not in the big numbers that we were. We're still getting 100 to 200 people out per day.
This type of rescue operation is nothing new to Dave Eubank of the Free Burma Rangers.
We're trying to help people get out any way we can. And I'm really grateful to the Tajik government that right now has a very humanitarian look of how can we help people.
The White House and State Department put the number of U.S. citizens left behind to about 100. Robichaux says the math doesn't add up.
The truth is, it's not a few hundred. My guess is at least 5,000.
Whatever the number, U.S. citizens are in danger.
They are hunting down people right now, trying to get all the names of anyone they perceive as an enemy.
They're scared. They don't know what to do. They feel abandoned by our country that has a responsibility to help them.
Robichaux and Eubank say leaving no one behind is an American value.
The truth is, it doesn't matter if it's 5,000. It doesn't matter if it's 200. It doesn't matter if it's one. Because from where I come from as an American, especially in the special operations community, if one American is behind enemy lines, if one American's life is in danger, we will use every bit of military force and strength and scorch the earth around that person to rescue that person.
He fears the Biden administration, news media, and much of the world are moving on. For Afghan women, life got a lot worse after this Taliban decree. All widows under the age of 35 whose husbands were killed in the previous regime, if they are still widowed, will marry the Mujahideen of the Islamic Emirate.
We have 20 million women that are immediately declared as sex slaves. The amount of trafficking, sex trafficking, that's going to happen out of Afghanistan.
Article 2. All patriotic and Muslim parents of Afghanistan are called upon to give your daughters over the age of 18 to be given to their husbands in order to maintain Islamic ethics.
Actually, almost every day, Chris, I had started to cry because I thought of these little girls left in the hands of the Taliban. And that's the biggest thing.
And Article 3. All women working in government offices are now ordered to stay in their homes.
The murder and persecution of Christians and all this stuff is happening right now. And it seems like not only the White House and the mainstream media, but the entire international community wants to be silent.
Yet the international community may soon decide if the Taliban will be Afghanistan's recognized government. The Taliban just nominated an ambassador to represent them at the UN. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Texas is limiting its business with Ben & Jerry's and its parent company Unilever over Ben & Jerry's decision to stop selling products in Israeli settlement communities. The state comptroller said the two companies have been added to the state's list of companies that boycott Israel. Arizona, Florida, and New Jersey announced plans to divest from Ben & Jerry's and Unilever earlier this month. Democrats in the House are making moves to write abortion into federal law, passing a measure Friday called the Women's Health Care Protection Act. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi prominently supported the bill, which guarantees a woman's right to an abortion.
This is about freedom of women to have choice about the size and timing of their families, not the business of people on the court or members of Congress, about themselves. But it's also about freedom from the danger of vigilantes.
The law she's referring to is in Texas, and it was allowed to take effect by the U.S. Supreme Court earlier this month, essentially halting most abortions in the Lone Star State. In December, the Supreme Court will hear arguments in a separate case, that one from Mississippi, with implications on the future of Roe v. Wade. Pelosi, who's Catholic and a mother of 5, pushed back against the Archbishop of San Francisco, who described the measure as child sacrifice. Pelosi calling it a disagreement of perspective.
For us, it was a complete and total blessing, which we enjoy every day of our lives. But it's none of our business how other people choose the size and timing of their families.
The House abortion bill is unlikely to pass in the Senate, but President Biden has said that he will sign the measure into law if it does make it to his desk. Coming up, she's been called Courageous Heidi Crowder. Why this woman with Down syndrome who's taken a stand for life is making headlines around the world. A British woman with Down syndrome says she is going to keep fighting a pro-abortion law allowing women to terminate their pregnancies up until birth if testing shows the unborn baby will likely have Down syndrome. Heidi Crowder says she says even though a judge dismissed her case against the law, she is not finished. She plans to continue fighting for the rights of children with Down syndrome to be born, believing in the value of their lives. She pointed to another British citizen who did not give up as an example of her moral battle during his day, William Wilberforce, and his unpopular stand against slavery.
When Wilberforce wanted to change the law on slavery, he didn't give up. Even when events didn't always go his way. And when the going got tough, he kept going. And I'm going to do the same because I want to see changing the law to stop babies like me and the gorgeous Aiden being aborted up to birth because it's downright discrimination.
Crowder's suit says the law is not only discriminatory, it also violates the European Convention on Human Rights. Our media partner, FaithWire.com, was the first to bring you this story, and Tragon Phillips is with FaithWire.com. He joins us now with more. So, Trey, powerful images there of these children who are likely the very ones that Heidi wants to protect. She lost her case, as we know. So what is her next move?
So she's just vowing to keep fighting. I think she's going to, she wants to continue being public and front facing. She and the two other complainants who are on the case plan to do more of what we just saw and heard her doing, which is going out and just speaking to the public and trying to educate people around her, other Britons, about what the law says and how she views it as discriminatory against people who are like her.
What kind of support is she getting in the UK?
So she's getting a lot of support on the ground. Like when you go and you see where she's speaking, whether it's at the steps of the court there in that clip or elsewhere, she gathers large crowds. There's a lot of public support for her online as well, among the UK and obviously in the US as well. But in the situation in the UK is a bit different than it is here. They're a bit more pro-abortion than we are. So she's got a tough road ahead for her. It's definitely an upward climb.
Why is her fight so important, not just in her country, but really for the world when it comes to abortion and babies with disabilities?
You know, I think she put a fine point on it by saying that it enables discrimination against people who have Down syndrome or other sort of genetic disorders, because in the UK they allow abortion up to 24 weeks or up until birth if a child shows in prenatal testing to potentially have Down syndrome. So this is about discrimination. It is about human rights, and people like her raising their voices, particularly people with Down syndrome, saying, look, I am just as valuable as any other human, and as believers we know, made in the image of God, and I deserve just as much rights as anybody else. So I'm glad to see her raising her voice, and I think it's important for people like her to be part of the conversation, because this is the people that these laws are impacting.
Indeed. Now, as we reported, the judge dismissed her case. Any idea as to why?
So he said in his ruling, it was a panel, but the lead judge said in his ruling that the religious objections and maybe even the emotional feelings that these complainants had, including Heidi, was just not enough, in his opinion, to overturn the scientific facts in his mind that support leaving this law in place. So it's not really clear how they're going to go about this legally in the future. But that was his decision in this case, and we'll see what lawsuits Heidi and others might bring in the future.
Indeed, indeed. Trey Phillips with FaithWire.com. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Still ahead, Australians are calling it a police state. Extreme crackdowns over the coronavirus, despite few deaths in comparison to the overall population. We're going to have that story for you when we come back. COVID-19 has turned the land down under upside down. Australia was once known for its fierce individualism and defense of personal freedoms. But now extreme lockdowns and intense tracking of citizens have some calling the country a police state. All this when fewer than 1,200 residents have died from COVID in the nation of 25 million. Dale Hurd is on the story.
A viral tweet in Australian posted what they said is a view of the world's largest prison from space. A map of Australia. Australia is still a democracy, but its COVID restrictions are severe. It's hard to enter or leave the country unless you're a politician or a celebrity. Citizens are tracked with apps and soon by facial recognition. In some states, you have to have your phone scanned before entering a church. And some have been arrested for simply posting on social media about protest against COVID restrictions. The rest of the world is starting to ask if Australia can still be called a free country. Australia's lockdown has been so draconian, it's brought comparisons on social media to how Australia began, as a prison colony. This pregnant Australian mother was handcuffed and hauled away by cops in front of her children for simply posting on Facebook about a lockdown protest. The charge was incitement.
What on earth? Excuse me, what on earth?
Just put your phone down.
Can you record this? I'm in my pajamas.
What's this?
I have an ultrasound in an hour.
Yeah, she's pregnant.
This leader of an anti-lockdown group, also arrested for incitement, has now been in jail for 3 weeks.
You're under arrest for incitement.
Have you guys been following me?
Police helicopters look for lockdown violators like these folks trying to enjoy an evening on a rooftop. And the government has fired rubber bullets and tear gas at anti-lockdown protesters, including children. James Allen, Garrick Professor of Law at the University of Queensland, calls it heavy-handed despotism.
It's been appalling in Australia, and I say that as a big fan of Australia. I'm Canadian, you can tell from the accent. But it's come as a real shock to me how conservative friends are perfectly happy to go along with this.
Australia consists of 6 states and 2 territories, each with their own COVID restrictions. Under a new home quarantine plan for international travelers, if you don't send the government your photo and location when it sends you a text, the police will come to your door. Melbourne pastor Paul Furlong has been arrested 3 times and placed in solitary confinement for opening his church during the lockdowns.
The reason I did was for what I believe was a greater law, and that was to obey the word of God. And so I had to choose God's law over man's law.
This church in Sydney, shown before the lockdown, was raided and fined for holding what authorities called an illegal service and for not scanning people's phones before they entered. Some pastors are now concerned that the government could require a vaccine passport before entering a church. We asked Evan Mulholland at Australia's conservative think tank, the Institute of Public Affairs, if he still considers Australia a free country.
Well, it's a good question. It's a question a lot of people across the political spectrum have been asking. These things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen when the political and cultural elites slowly take away our freedoms and they become normalised.
Australians have also begun turning in one another to authorities, East German style. In this tweet, an Australian mother was desperate to find a way home with her son and needed to cross a state border, violating lockdown restrictions. She was turned in to police. With this kind of behavior, you might think many thousands of Australians have died from COVID. But the death toll is under 1,200 out of a nation of 25 million people, or 0.0047% of the population. Almost 3 times that many Australians die every week from normal causes. But one poll showed most Australians favor living without freedom because they fear COVID more than any other Western nation.
You know, the media has just scared people senseless. The average person thinks, if I catch this, I'm going to die.
There have been several large and sometimes violent demonstrations against the lockdowns and against planned vaccine passports, and hundreds have been arrested. The government says the death toll would have been much worse without lockdowns, and is saying now that life can only return to normal when most of the country is vaccinated.
They describe giving back our freedoms as some sort of a treat, as some sort of a reward. Something that can be given back to us and aren't our fundamental freedoms that were stolen from us in the first place.
The Australian journalist Clive James once said the problem with Australians is not that so many of them are descended from convicts, but that so many are descended from prison officers. It's a quote that's being talked about a lot these days. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Coming up, Denzel Washington talks about his faith and shares some of his conversations with God. We'll hear what that sounds like when we come back. Stay with us. Oscar-winning actor Denzel Washington says God has been telling him in recent years to feed my sheep. He was speaking at an Orlando men's conference, and the Christian Post reports that he told them he wasn't quite sure what that means and it could differ from time to time. So he's looking to pastors to help guide him. During an on-stage discussion with Pastor A.R. Bernard, the senior pastor of the Christian Cultural Center in Brooklyn, New York, Washington told the audience, quote, "At 66, getting ready to be 67, having just buried my mother, I made a promise to her and to God not just to do good the right way, but to honor my mother and my father by the way I live my life the rest of my days on earth. I'm here to serve, to help, to provide." Washington also addressed the role of men in our changing world. He says men may not need to follow the John Wayne formula, but strength, leadership, power, authority, guidance, and patience are God's gift to the men, and they should cherish them and not abuse them. Time now for your Monday motivation. Here's a word to jumpstart your week. Watch your words. What you say matters. Scripture tells us life and death are in the power of the tongue. Be sure you're choosing to speak life. Your words move God. With that word, I encourage you to make this a marvelous Monday and be sure to have yourself a wonderful week. Do that with purpose and do it on purpose. That is going to do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. Thank you so much for watching. I want to remind you, you can always find more of our programs on the CBN News Channel. You can also find them online at cbnnews.com. There you can find them at any time. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today. Feel free to email us. The address is right there at the bottom of your screen, newswatch@cbn.com. And of course, you can always reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We would love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you right back here, same time tomorrow.